Washington wanted its bourbon back on Canadian shelves so badly that it became one of the central demands in the entire trade negotiation. Prime Minister Mark Carney actually asked Canada's premiers to restore American alcohol as part of the deal, but the talks collapsed, 50% tariffs slammed down on $20 billion of Canadian goods, and Carney suspended negotiations, entirely a move that could leave American producers facing a major loss in one of their biggest markets. Most Canadian provinces had pulled U.S. beer, wine, and spirits from their shelves after President Trump imposed tariffs, and that removal became one of Washington's biggest complaints against Canada. American alcohol was not a side issue in the talks. It was a specific demand the United States pressed hard. So in August, after briefing provincial leaders, Carney asked Canada's premiers to put American alcohol back on store shelves as part of the intense trade negotiations. Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston confirmed the request directly, revealing that restoring U.S. booze had become part of Canada's negotiating offer. The push was real, and it came from the top. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew said Carney was pushing hard for the provinces to restore American alcohol, signaling that the Prime Minister saw the concession as valuable enough to lean on his provincial counterparts. That mattered because, in Canada, alcohol is controlled by provincial governments, not Ottawa. Carney could ask, but the premiers held the actual power over what returned to the shelves. His willingness to press them publicly showed how much Washington wanted this and how central bourbon had become to the broader deal. But the issue turned politically explosive almost immediately because some provincial leaders remained cautious. Restoring American alcohol was not a simple administrative step. It was a reversal of a boycott that had become a symbol of Canadian resistance to Trump's tariffs. Premiers who had built political capital on standing up to Washington were being asked to hand back one of the most visible signs of that resistance. The request exposed a tension between the federal government's desire for a deal and the province's reluctance to appear to surrender. Then came the second complication, the consumers themselves. Canadian shoppers told reporters they might not buy American products even if they returned. During the boycott, many had switched to Canadian brands, and they had no intention of switching back. In Ontario, shoppers said flatly there was not a chance they would buy American booze if it came back. That gives the whole story a twist Washington did not account for. The United States wanted shelf access restored, but Canadian consumers may have already changed their buying habits permanently. Getting the bottles back on the shelf would not guarantee anyone bought them. For a while, though, it genuinely looked like a broader deal was within reach. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc said the two sides were very close after negotiations with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. The proposed understanding reportedly involved changes around steel, aluminum, autos, and American alcohol, while Canada worked to preserve important parts of its trade relationship and domestic policies. Carney himself said substantial progress had been made, even as important work remained. On Tuesday, Trump had paused the tariffs for 3 days and posted on social media that the two sides have a deal. Officials on both sides seemed optimistic, right up until the final moment. And then it collapsed. On August 21st, minutes before the midnight deadline, the negotiations fell apart. Carney announced that, while important progress had been made, that progress was not enough to meet Canada's objectives. As a result, this evening, I've decided to suspend trade negotiations with the U.S. and have directed Canada's negotiators to return to Ottawa, he said in a statement released just before the deadline. The bourbon Washington had been pushing so hard to recover never made it into a finished agreement because there was no finished agreement. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. The tariffs took effect at the stroke of midnight. 50% duties landed on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, hockey sticks, building materials, liquor, cement, and certain kinds of clothing. And Carney did not absorb the blow quietly. Canada will match those tariffs dollar for dollar to protect our workers and businesses, he said. Canada suspended the talks and committed to retaliating in full, setting the two economies on an escalatory path rather than a resolution. The deal that had looked so close on Tuesday was dead by Saturday morning. Each side blamed the other for the breakdown. Greer said Canadian negotiators made 11th-hour demands that upended a draft deal worked out over days of talks, arguing that new demands and walkbacks had disrupted a careful balance. Carney told a different story, that last-minute changes in the U.S. proposed terms were unfair, uneconomic, and called into question the reliability of any deal. His negotiators, he said, had worked in good faith to defend Canadian interests up until the very last minute. The two accounts point at opposite culprits, but the result was the same: no deal and tariffs live. The irony of the Bourbon demand is sharp in hindsight. Washington spent significant negotiating energy trying to get American alcohol back onto Canadian shelves, and Carney went so far as to lean on his premiers to make it happen. Yet the collapse means the boycott not only continues, but hardens. The provincial bans remain, the American alcohol stays off the shelves, and Canadian consumers who switch to local brands have even less reason to switch back now that the trade war has escalated rather than eased. The Bourbon Washington wanted is further from Canadian shelves today than it was during the negotiations. The economic reality behind the collapse is more nuanced than the drama suggests. Analysts noted that the $20 billion in tariff goods is not, by itself, an economic game changer for the enormous U.S. economy. Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute observed that economically, the specific tariffs are not that important, but the relationship itself is extremely important. The real danger, as University of Toronto economist Joseph Steinberg noted, is retaliation, which could prove devastating to specific targeted industries. One of those is the Canadian alcohol industry, which depends on the United States as its main export partner, meaning the sector at the center of the Bourbon dispute is now exposed on both sides. Carney moved immediately to cushion the impact at home. He announced additional measures to support Canadian workers and businesses, adding to the nearly $25 billion in support Ottawa has provided over the past 18 months. He struck a defiant tone, saying Canada's economic growth is accelerating and that Ottawa would not allow any nation to determine our future. That framing reflects the political reality Carney was elected on a promise to stand up to. Trump and walking away from an unfavorable deal aligns with the mandate that made him popular in the first place. The collapse leaves the Bourbon question exactly where it started, only worse. Washington begged for its whiskey back, made it a centerpiece of the negotiation, and watched Carney push his premiers toward restoring it. Then the deal that would have delivered it disintegrated minutes before the deadline. Now 50% tariffs are live, Canada is retaliating dollar for dollar, the negotiators have gone home to Ottawa, and no further talks are scheduled. American bourbon became a major bargaining chip in a trade fight that ultimately fell apart, and instead of returning to Canadian shelves, it remains locked out of a market that has spent 18 months learning to live without it.